Hello, my curious friend, and a very warm welcome to Deepfield Channel. Tonight, we will venture into one of the greatest mysteries our species holds within itself, the story of how the human voice learned to fold itself into words, how the primal silence was first broken into something carrying meaning, and how that unlikely moment shaped everything we are. I promise to try not to make the subject so fascinating that sleep is left outside waiting. But before we dive into this ancient mystery, I would love to know in the comments which corner of the world you're listening to me from tonight. If you're feeling too lazy, just leave a simple hello. That small gesture shows YouTube that our space is welcoming and helps us bring more tired minds to relax here with us. If you enjoy our scientific journeys, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And to you who are already part of this silent and curious community, thank you very much. If you want to get even closer, consider becoming a channel member. Members get early access to videos before anyone else. The link is in the description. Now, wherever you are, find a really comfortable position. If sleep comes, accept the invitation. Let us begin. There is something you do every day without thinking, which is probably the most extraordinary feat in the history of life on Earth. You speak. You move air through your lungs, vibrate two small folds of tissue at the back of your throat, shape that air with your tongue and lips, and out of nowhere meaning emerges. Understanding arises. Connection sparks between minds living in separate bodies. It is so routine that it has become invisible, like gravity or the rhythm of the heart. But if you pause for a moment and truly consider what is happening when a word leaves your mouth, you will realize you are facing something that nature took tens of millions of years to build, and that our species took hundreds of thousands of years to learn to use the way we do today. Spoken language is so old that it left no fossils. Words do not fossilize, sounds do not harden into stone, and it is precisely this lack of direct evidence that makes the search for the first human word one of the most passionate and frustrating scientific investigations in existence. Researchers must trace the past of human speech without having the speech itself, like a detective who must solve a crime without witnesses, without a body and without a weapon, relying only on indirect clues scattered across time. Think for a moment about how you learned to speak. You don't remember, of course. No one does. Before the age of 3, the human brain goes through a developmental window so intense that explicit memories simply do not form with the same solidity. But it happened. You heard sounds repeatedly. Your brain began to separate those sounds into categories. You tried to imitate, you failed, you tried again. And at some point, a specific combination of sounds attached itself to an object, a sensation, an intention, and a word was born for you. All of humanity went through something vaguely similar, only distributed across generations upon generations, on a timescale that defies imagination. When scientists talk about human language, they're generally distinguishing our communication from everything else in the animal kingdom. And here is the first great surprise, the first knot worth carefully untying. Animals communicate, and they do so quite sophisticatedly. Bees dance to indicate the direction and distance of food sources. Octopuses change colour and texture in sequences that seem to convey internal states. Whales sing melodies that travel across hundreds of oceanic kilometres. Chimpanzees use specific calls for different predators, calls that approach something akin to isolated words. So what separates all this from human language? The answer does not lie in the volume of information, nor in the complexity of the sounds, nor even in the communicative intent. The answer lies in something linguists call recursiveness, combined with displacement and productivity. These are 3 concepts worth understanding calmly, because together they form the essence of what a human word is. Recursiveness is the ability to nest structures within structures in a potentially infinite manner. When you say that you know that he thinks that she believes that it is true, you are building a Russian doll of meanings, each thought embedded within another. No other known animal communication system does this in a productive and open way. The alarm calls of monkeys, however precise, do not nest inside one another to create new meanings. They are closed, fixed units. Displacement is the ability to talk about things that are not present here and now. You can tell me about a dream you had last week. You can describe a place you visited in your childhood. You can explain to me how something that doesn't even exist yet works. An imaginary machine, a hypothetical world, a plan for tomorrow. Animals, with rare and debated exceptions, communicate the present. The bee dances about where the nectar is right now. The monkey screams about the predator that is arriving right now. Human language travels through time with astonishing freedom. Productivity is perhaps the most dizzying of the three. With a finite number of sounds, human language can generate an infinite number of sentences. English has a few dozen phonemes, the elementary sounds that distinguish one syllable from another. With these basic blocks, we form words. With words, we form sentences. With sentences, we form arguments, stories, poems, lies, revelations, conspiracies, declarations of love, and mathematical theorems. The number of sentences that the English language can produce and that have never yet been spoken by anyone is, for all practical purposes, infinite. This radical openness, this unlimited potential for expression from limited elements, is what no other natural communication system demonstrates. Now that we have this firm ground, we can ask ourselves when exactly this capacity arose. And here we enter the territory of myth and science at the same time, because the question is simple but the answer is extraordinarily slippery. One of the greatest popular misconceptions about human language is that it appeared suddenly, like a switch someone flipped. According to this view, at some point our ancestors were as silent as other animals, and then, suddenly, they began to speak. Modern science paints a very different and much more interesting picture. Language seems to have emerged gradually, built upon layers of pre-adaptations that evolved for reasons completely unrelated to speech, such as the position of the hyoid bone in the throat, voluntary control of breathing, the neural mirror system that allows us to imitate others, and the reorganization of brain proportions over millions of years. The hyoid bone deserves a special pause. It is the only bone in the human body that does not articulate with any other. It floats alone at the base of the tongue, anchored by muscles and tendons, and is fundamentally important for the precise movements of speech. In modern humans, it has a U-shape that positions the larynx lower in the throat than in other primates. This lower positioning of the larynx is what allows the articulation of distinct vowels like the ones we use in speech, but it comes with an impressive cost. We are the only mammals that can choke to death on food, because our low larynx means the path of food and the path of air cross dangerously. This anatomical detail alone tells us something profound. Articulated speech was important enough to be preserved by natural selection, even with this serious physical cost. Evolution is neither perfect nor careful, but it tends to eliminate traits that kill their carriers before reproduction. If the low larynx remained, it is because the advantages it brought, the ability to speak with more nuance, to coordinate groups, to transmit complex information, clearly outweighed the risk of choking. Fossils of the hyoid bone are extremely rare because they're so small and delicate, but some have been found. A Neanderthal specimen discovered in Israel, over 60,000 years old, features a hyoid bone with a shape very similar to that of modern humans. This fueled decades of debate over whether Neanderthals spoke, and if so, to what extent. The issue is still not fully resolved, but most experts today believe they probably had some form of vocal communication more sophisticated than a simple grunt. Another myth worth dispelling is that language arose just once, in a single place, and then spread. Modern geneticists and archaeologists suggest a more diffuse and richer picture, where linguistic capacities probably developed in parallel among different populations of Homo sapiens, and perhaps among our close relatives, before consolidating into the full form we recognize today. Language was not an invention with a single inventor. It was a process, an accumulation, a slow transformation that perhaps involved hundreds of generations of silent experimentation. The human brain, in this context, is the most relevant structure of all. Not simply because it is larger. An elephant's brain is physically much larger than a human's, and a whale's is even bigger. What matters is the internal organisation of the human brain and certain regions that seem to be unique or greatly expanded compared to other primates. Two of them have famous names for anyone who has studied neuroscience: Broca's area, located in the left frontal lobe, and Wernicke's area in the left temporal lobe. Broca's area is involved with speech production, with the ability to form grammatical sequences, with the motor planning of mouth and tongue movements. Wernicke's area is involved with language comprehension, with recognizing meaning in the sound sequences that reach the ears. These two areas are connected by a bundle of nerve fibers called the arcuate fasciculus, and the robustness and organization of this bundle in humans are remarkably different from what is observed in other primates. In chimpanzees, for example, there is a homologous structure, but it is much less developed and less connected. This difference in neural hardware suggests that language did not arise out of nowhere, but was built upon a more primitive communication architecture that already existed in the common ancestors we share with other great apes, and was gradually refined and expanded over millions of years. There is also the gene called FOXP2, which became famous in the 90s when researchers identified a British family known as the KE family, in which half the members had a mutation in this gene and presented serious problems with both speech and certain aspects of grammar. When the Neanderthal genome was sequenced, it was discovered that they had the modern human version of FOXP2, not the version found in chimpanzees. This was interpreted by many as further evidence that Neanderthals might have had some form of linguistic capacity, but FOXP2 is not the language gene, as it is sometimes poorly described in popular media. It is a gene that regulates the development of structures that language uses, among other functions. Language does not have a single gene. It is the product of hundreds of genes interacting with the environment and culture over time. The physical stage upon which the first word was spoken was a world very different from the one we inhabit today. Anatomically modern humans, those with skulls and skeletons practically identical to ours, appear in the African fossil record about 300,000 years ago. But evidence of clearly symbolic behaviour, such as ornaments, paintings, abstract engravings, and ritual burials, emerges more robustly from about 100,000 years ago, with a notable acceleration around 50,000 years ago, in the period archaeologists sometimes call the Cognitive Revolution or the Upper Paleolithic Explosion. This symbolic behaviour is important because language and symbolism are deeply intertwined. A word is not a thing. A word is a symbol that represents a thing, an action, a quality, or a relationship. The ability to use symbols arbitrarily, to collectively agree that this specific sequence of sounds will represent this specific object, is the beating heart of human language. And this capacity seems to have blossomed alongside other forms of symbolic thought, such as art and ritual. In the Blombos Caves, on the southern coast of South Africa, archaeologists found red ochre engraved with geometric patterns dating back at least 77,000 years, and perforated shells used as necklace beads over 100,000 years ago. These beads are particularly revealing. A necklace bead is an object that has no practical value in itself. It only has value within a system of shared meanings. To use a bead as an ornament indicating group belonging, social status, or individual identity, there must be a collective convention, a language of symbols that other people recognize and interpret. And a language of symbols did not arise isolated from what we call spoken language. Most likely, both grew together, feeding off each other. The thought that lingers at the end of this first contemplation is this: all this biological structure, all this neural architecture, all this anatomical reorganization over millions of years, all of this formed the instrument. But an instrument needs energy to sound. The body evolved to be able to speak. The brain developed regions to organize speech. The anatomy of the throat reconfigured to allow more varied sounds. But where did the first impulse come from that set all this in motion, that transformed silent potential into sound laden with meaning, that made the first human mind realize that a sound could be tied to a sense and transmitted to another mind through the air? The question left hanging in the air like the smoke that precedes fire was about energy. Not the energy of a contracting muscle or an expanding lung. There was something prior to that. Something more like an internal pressure seeking an outlet, like water finding the smallest crack in a wall and insisting there until the crack becomes a passage. To understand what set speech in motion for the first time, one must descend to this more fundamental level, where the forces governing human behaviour had no names yet, but already operated with all their silent power. Think of a kettle on the stove. The water heats up, the molecules agitate, the pressure grows inside the closed container. The kettle does not decide to whistle. It whistles because the internal pressure exceeds its capacity to contain it. The sound is not a choice. It is an inevitable consequence of accumulation. Something very similar was happening inside groups of hominids living in open forests and savannas during what paleoanthropologists call the Middle Pleistocene, that long stretch of time corresponding roughly to the last 800,000 years before the present. Social pressure, the need to coordinate increasingly complex behaviours, the urgency to transmit intentions that gestures alone could no longer translate with sufficient precision. All this accumulated like steam inside a biological structure that was slowly being remodelled to serve as a valve. The linguist and evolutionary biologist Tecumseh Fitch, who has spent decades investigating the origins of speech in vertebrates, frequently uses the metaphor of a pressure system when describing the emergence of complex vocal communication. He proposes that the voice did not arise from nothing, but was recruited from already existing functions like an instrument redirected to a new melody without its physical structure needing to be completely overhauled. The precursors of human speech, he argues, were all present in other species long before anything we could call language existed. What changed was the context that demanded new combination, a new orchestration from these precursors. Before naming the forces that govern this process, it is worth feeling each of them. Imagine a group of people in a dense forest, without light, without mutual visibility. Gesture, which for millennia was the main vehicle of communication among primates, becomes useless in the dark. But sound pierces the darkness. Sound bends around trunks, climbs through canopies, reaches where the eye cannot. There is a first force at work here, almost a law of physics applied to communication. Sound has a range independent of the line of sight. This is the property of omnidirectional propagation of the sound wave, which physicists describe through wave equations in elastic media. The air, compressed and expanded by the vocal apparatus, creates disturbances that propagate in all directions simultaneously at a speed of approximately 340 meters per second at sea level. A gesture requires someone to be looking. A sound requires nothing but ears. The second force is more subtle and perhaps more profound. When an animal vocalizes, it reveals information about itself that it did not necessarily intend to reveal. The frequency of a roar tells the size of the body that produced it. The trembling quality of a call can betray fear. The rhythmic regularity of a song indicates health and vigor. What biologists call signal honesty, the idea that certain sounds are physically difficult to fake because they require real capacities to be produced, created a basic reliability in vocalization over the course of evolution. In other words, even before human speech existed as a symbolic system, the voice already carried true information about who produced it. This primitive reliability was, so to speak, the foundation upon which arbitrary meanings, the first vocal symbols, could be built. Without this basis of biological authenticity, perhaps no community would have developed the willingness to trust the sounds emitted by others as bearers of meaning. Charles Darwin, in his work on the expression of emotions in humans and animals, published in 1872, had already noted that the sounds produced in states of intense emotional excitement, both in humans and other mammals, share remarkably similar acoustic characteristics. High-pitched and fast sounds associated with fear or pain, low and long sounds associated with threat, soft and repetitive sounds associated with care and bonding. Darwin saw in this a common evolutionary heritage. evidence that the emotional musicality of the human voice was not invented, but inherited and refined along a lineage that long predates Homo sapiens. What Darwin intuited with the elegance of a 19th century observer, 21st century neuroscientists confirmed with electrodes and magnetic resonance imaging. The brain regions that process the emotional content of the voice are evolutionarily older than the regions that process the semantic content of words. There is a classic experiment that illustrates this in a disturbing way. Researchers asked participants to listen to sentences spoken in languages completely unknown to them, languages from cultures they had no prior contact with, and to try to identify solely by intonation whether the sentence expressed anger, joy, sadness, or fear. The results were consistent across studies conducted in dozens of countries and cultures. People guessed at a rate far above chance, even without understanding a single word of what was being said. Emotion leaks through sound with a fidelity that crosses all linguistic barriers because it does not belong to the cultural layer of language. It belongs to something much older, that musicality of internal state that Darwin identified and that our ancestors shared with monkeys, birds, and probably the first mammals. But human speech is not just vocalized emotion. There is a qualitative leap here that we need to contemplate carefully, because it represents perhaps the greatest fundamental imbalance in the entire history of animal communication. Most non-human communication systems are, in the technical language of linguistics, indexical. This means the signal is directly linked to an immediate situation. The alarm call of a vervet monkey refers to a predator that is present now, visible or audible in the immediate environment. The signal cannot be used to talk about a predator that passed by yesterday, or one that might appear tomorrow, or a type of predator that exists in another forest the monkey has never visited. The signal is a reaction, not a representation. What human language did, and what probably no other animal communication system has done with the same depth and productivity, was to introduce arbitrariness and displacement. Arbitrariness means the sound does not need to resemble what it represents. The word stone does not sound like a stone. The word silence is not silent. The word love does not have the warm texture that the experience of love has. There is a rupture between the signifier and the signified, and this rupture is precisely what frees language from all ties to the immediate present. Displacement, a concept associated with linguist Charles Hockett, who in the 60s compiled a list of defining properties of human language compared to animal systems, is the ability to refer to things that are not present in the space and time of communication. I can speak of the past, I can speak of the future, and I can speak of worlds that never existed. Hockett identified more than a dozen characteristics that, in combination, differentiate human language from any other known communication system. Among the most important are productivity, which is the ability to produce and understand an infinite number of new messages from a finite set of elements, and cultural transmission, which is the fact that language is learned and not simply inherited genetically. But the most powerful imbalance, the most destabilizing and creative force in this entire system, is perhaps recursiveness, the ability to nest structures within structures without theoretical limit. The man saw the bird is a sentence. The man who lived in the greenhouse saw the bird that sang on winter mornings is another sentence, and we could continue nesting clauses within clauses indefinitely, creating meanings of increasing complexity from the same basic elements. This recursive capacity is what linguist Noam Chomsky and his colleagues, in work published in 2002, identified as the computational core of human language, the element that makes it qualitatively different from any other communicative system. Chomsky spent decades arguing that this capacity, which he called the faculty of language in the narrow sense, was an exclusively human evolutionary novelty, arising relatively late in our history. But this position sparked heated debates. Fitch, along with Mark Hauser and Daniel Everett, among others, questioned parts of this thesis, suggesting that recursion may have precursors in other species, and that the boundary between what is exclusively human and what is shared with other animals is more porous than Chomsky proposed. The debate continues to this day, but what it reveals is perhaps more interesting than the definitive answer. Human language is not a monolithic block that appeared ready-made. It is an architecture built from pieces that came from different places, assembled in unprecedented combinations. Daniel Everett, who lived for decades with the Piraha people in the Brazilian Amazon, brought an unexpected empirical disruption to this debate. The Piraha speak a language that, according to Everett, presents characteristics that contradict some of the predictions of Chomskyan universal grammar. The Piraha language, he argues, does not use embedded recursion in the way the theory predicted as universal. If this is confirmed, it means there is at least one human language that functions in a radically different way from the rest, which would call into question the idea that there is an innate and universal grammatical structure in the human brain. Other linguists vigorously contest Everett's analysis, and the Pirahan debate has become one of the most fertile and irritating in contemporary linguistics. Fertile because it forces deep re-evaluations, irritating because field data are difficult to verify independently. What these debates reveal, when viewed from a certain distance, is that human language does not have a single origin, a single cause, a single driving force. It emerged from the convergence of multiple pressures. The social pressure of living in large groups, the cognitive pressure of increasingly complex mental worlds, the ecological pressure of environments that demanded coordination and planning, and that deeper, harder-to-name pressure, which is simply the compulsion to share inner experience with another mind. This last pressure, which psychologists sometimes call the motivation for joint attention, shared attention, is the desire to make another person see what you're seeing, think what you're thinking, feel something similar to what you feel. Michael Tomasello from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology has dedicated decades to studying how human children and chimpanzees learn and communicate. One of his most important discoveries is that human babies, long before they develop speech, demonstrate a behavior that chimpanzees, even the smartest and most trained ones, rarely exhibit spontaneously. They point at things with no immediate benefit, just to share another human being's attention on something interesting. A 10-month-old baby points at a bird in the sky, not because it wants the bird. It points because it wants you to see the bird too, because it wants to create a moment of shared experience. This seemingly simple gesture is, for Tomasello, the deepest motivational root of human language. Not the need to request, not the fear of a predator, but the impulse to commune. And here we arrive at the local mechanism in its most elementary form. A mind perceives something, a fruit on a branch, a cloud of smoke on the horizon, the face of a stranger, and simultaneously feels two things: the experience of what it perceives and the desire for another mind to perceive it too. The vocal apparatus produces a sound. The sound travels through the air. Another mind receives it. If the sound has been sufficiently consistent the last few times it was produced alongside this type of situation, the receiving mind begins to associate the sound with the situation. A convention begins to be born, not by decree, not by conscious invention, but through repetition within a shared context. What happens when this mechanism of convention repeats itself, not twice, not 100 times, but millions of times, across generations, in hundreds of groups scattered across entire continents, each group facing its own challenges, each human mind born into a bath of sounds already laden with meaning and learning to swim in them before even understanding that they are conventions and not natural laws? When this mechanism of convention multiplies through generations, something begins to happen that no individual mind could have planned or even imagined. The sounds that serve to point out fruits and smokes and faces begin to organize among themselves, to create internal relationships, to develop consistencies that go beyond any particular situation. It is no longer just a sound tied to a thing. It is a network of sounds, each defining the others by contrast, each occupying a space that no other occupies, the entire system sustaining itself like a web where every thread tensions all the others. 20th century linguists, when they began to look at the world's languages not as exotic curiosities, but as systems to be analysed with rigour, were disturbed by a discovery that seemed impossible at first glance. Human groups that had never had contact with each other, separated by oceans and mountains and millennia of independent history, had developed linguistic structures that presented profound similarities. Not the same words, not the same sounds, but the same types of patterns, the same grammatical categories appearing in different places, the same solutions to the same communication problems, reinvented independently on different continents. Joseph Greenberg was one of the first to systematize this strange regularity. In the middle decades of the last century, he compiled data from hundreds of languages and looked for what he called linguistic universals, not properties that every language shared identically, but tendencies so strong and widespread that they seem to reflect something about the nature of the human mind rather than the particular historical circumstances of each group. One of his most cited discoveries involved the order in which subjects, verbs, and objects tend to appear in the world's languages. Of all the logically possible orderings, only a few proved common, and one was by far the most frequent, not because some universal mother tongue had decreed it, but because that particular ordering seemed to resonate with something in the way the human mind organizes events, agents, and actions. What Greenberg was seeing, without yet having the complete theoretical vocabulary to describe it, was the product of millions of local conventions converging on similar solutions under similar pressures. Every human group needs to talk about who does what to whom. Every human group needs to distinguish questions from statements. Every human group needs to find a way to indicate that something happened in the past or is yet to happen. These needs are not cultural in the arbitrary sense. They are cognitive needs that emerge from the structure of conscious experience. And when the same needs meet the same pressures, the solutions that arise through the accumulation of conventions tend to approximate each other, not becoming identical, but belonging to the same family of possibilities. There is a geometry to this that only becomes visible when you look from far enough away. Imagine all human languages arranged in an imaginary space, where the distance between two languages reflects how much they differ in structure. This space would not be evenly distributed. There would be densely populated regions, solutions that many independent languages found in slightly different ways, and there would be nearly empty regions, combinations of properties that would be logically possible, but that almost no human language has ever inhabited. Humanity, throughout all its linguistic diversity, has not randomly explored the space of all possible languages. It has circled a relatively restricted neighbourhood of this space, pushed there by the architecture of the mind, which is everywhere the same. This geometry has dimensions that researchers are still trying to map. One of them involves the relationship between complexity and regularity. Languages that developed highly elaborate case systems, precisely marking the grammatical functions of each element, tend to be freer in word order, since the function is already expressed in the form of the word itself. Languages that abandoned or never developed elaborate case systems tend to compensate by using position in the sentence to indicate function. It is not a decree. It is not a universal law without exceptions. It is a pressure, a tendency, a gravitational field that pulls linguistic systems in predictable directions, while still allowing considerable variation. Another dimension of this geometry was explored by Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Whorf, whose ideas about the relationship between language and thought generated decades of debate and have not yet been entirely resolved. The question they posed, in different forms and with varying degrees of radicalism, was whether the patterns of a language not only reflected the categories its speakers already possessed, but actively shaped how those speakers perceived the world. If a language lacks a word for a distinction, do speakers of that language make the distinction less sharply? If a language forces its speakers to specify certain aspects of reality in every sentence, like verb tense, does that affect how those speakers think about time? The most sophisticated experiments of recent decades have shown something interesting and more subtle than Whorf imagined. Language does not determine thought in a rigid way, but it influences patterns of attention, creates habits of categorization, facilitates certain cognitive operations while making others slightly less natural. The map is not the territory, but the map influences how you traverse the territory. And since each generation receives the map of their languages before developing the critical capacity to question its categories, the influence accumulates over time in ways that are difficult to separate from pure experience. The geographic distribution of language families across the planet tells a story of migrations, separations, and independent developments that historical linguists have spent 2 centuries trying to reconstruct. When human groups separate and lose contact with each other, their languages begin to diverge. Sounds change according to regular patterns, words acquire new meanings, grammars reorganize. Given enough time, languages that were mutually intelligible become distinct. With even more time, they become so different that only systematic comparative analysis reveals that they once descended from a common ancestor. William Jones, a British judge working in India in the late 18th century, was the first to clearly articulate with detailed evidence that Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin shared a common ancestor. The similarities he documented between words for family, numbers, body parts, and fundamental concepts were too systematic to be coincidence. When the same root appears in Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Gothic, and Old Persian, with regular and predictable phonetic changes between them, the only coherent explanation is that they all descend from a language spoken by a population that dispersed, and whose descendants continued to transform the inherited heritage each in their own way. Jones's work opened an entire field. In the following century, linguists like Rasmus Rask, Jakob Grimm, and August Schleicher developed increasingly rigorous methods to reconstruct ancestral languages from the comparative study of their descendants. Grimm precisely documented the regular correspondences between consonants in Latin and Greek on one hand, and Germanic languages on the other, correspondences so systematic that they could not be explained by borrowing or coincidence, and that revealed a process of phonetic change operating as a silent mechanism across generations. What became known as Grimm's Law was one of the first moments when linguistics demonstrated the power to discover historical regularities as precise as those of a natural science. Schleicher went further and tried to reconstruct the ancestral language itself, which he called Proto-Indo-European, from systematic comparisons among its known descendants. The endeavour was audacious and inevitably speculative, as no texts in Proto-Indo-European had survived, and no texts ever will, since the language was spoken before the invention of writing. But the logic of comparative reconstruction is powerful. If words for wolf, snow, sheep, and birch appear in clearly related forms in languages derived from a common ancestor, we can infer that the speakers of that ancestor lived in an environment where wolves and snow and sheep and birches were part of the everyday horizon. Language keeps memories of the world that formed it, and here the geometry of linguistic space meets the geometry of physical space. Language families are not randomly distributed across the globe. They form patterns that reflect population movements, geographic barriers, migration routes, and centres of cultural irradiation. Linguistic diversity is extraordinarily high in some regions, like Papua New Guinea and certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where hundreds of distinct languages coexist in geographically limited areas, the product of long human occupation with fragmentation due to rugged terrain or social organisation patterns that favoured the isolation of small groups. In other regions, a single language family expanded to cover vast expanses, the product of historical migrations or cultural advantages that allowed specific groups to spread over previous populations. The distribution is not just horizontal, geographic, but also vertical in time. Languages die when their last communities of speakers are absorbed by larger groups, or when the conditions that sustained them disappear. New languages arise when communities isolate themselves and develop their own divergent conventions. There is a dynamic balance between diversification and homogenization, between the forces that separate groups and create new distinctions and the forces that bring them together and merge what was separated. In some historical periods, diversification dominated. In others, homogenization. The linguistic map we have today is the provisional result of tens of millennia of this never-ending process. What emerges when looking at all these patterns together is the image of a system that no mind planned, but that has extraordinary coherence. Each local convention obeys local pressures. Each sound change follows its own paths. Each generation transmits and transforms what it received without a conscious project of preservation or innovation. And yet the global result has structure. It has regularities. It has tendencies that reveal themselves when one analyzes not one language, but the set of all of them. Not one moment, but the sequence of all of them. Typological linguists of the late 20th century, such as Matthew Dreyer and Martin Haspel-Math, built databases of hundreds of the world's languages, coding structural properties into comparable categories, and produced maps showing how these properties are distributed geographically. The correlations that emerge from these maps reveal diffusion influences, cases where features spread across geographically close but genetically unrelated languages, as if there were a structural contagion crossing barriers of ancestry. Languages that coexist in space tend to become more similar in certain structural dimensions, regardless of their historical kinship, suggesting that speakers living in constant contact create mutual pressures on their linguistic systems that slowly bring them closer. This phenomenon of convergence by contact is the mirror of the phenomenon of divergence by separation. The two together create the landscape we see, with islands of similarity here, zones of gradual transition there, and abrupt contrasts at cultural or geographic borders. Human language on a global scale is a mosaic with an internal logic that only reveals itself when one learns to look at it the right way, not as a collection of curiosities, but as the product of a single process operating in parallel in thousands of places over a time that exceeds the memory of any civilization. And there is something in this large-scale organization that raises a question that cannot be answered solely with structural patterns and geographic distributions. The system we described, with all its emergent coherence and universal tendencies and local adaptations, would it have taken this shape if human communities had remained the same size as those first bands of a few dozen individuals where the first conventions were woven? There is something that human groups acquired over time, something that amplified the possible complexity of linguistic systems and allowed patterns that would be unstable on a small scale to become robust and productive on a large scale, something that the next part of this journey will name and explore with the attention it deserves. The amplifier is not a tool. It is not an invention someone conceived on an afternoon and passed on to neighbours like the knowledge of how to prepare an ointment or how to bend wood over fire. It is older than any technique, more diffuse than any habit, and at the same time more concrete than any object a human hand has ever held. The amplifier is human density itself, the tendency groups had over millennia to become larger, to draw closer, to overlap, to create the conditions in which a language no longer needs to be reinvented every generation, but can be inherited, accumulated, stratified. When a community of a few dozen people shares a system of sounds and meanings, that system is intrinsically fragile. Every death is a disproportionate loss. Each new generation needs to absorb everything the previous one built from a very limited number of models. If an elder who knew how to name certain properties of plants dies before transferring that vocabulary, the vocabulary simply vanishes. There is not enough redundancy to absorb the loss. The languages of small groups have a characteristic that linguists have repeatedly observed. They're often more complex in their grammatical structure than the languages of large groups, because each speaker needs to master the entire system, and there is no pressure to simplify it to facilitate the entry of new speakers. The system is dense, precious, and at the same time vulnerable like a crystal that supports its own weight, only as long as the temperature remains stable. What happens when groups begin to gather, when villages grow, when trade routes create regular meeting points, when a drought forces scattered populations to converge on riverbanks that still have water? when an agricultural technology allows an area to feed not 50 people, but 500 or 5,000. What happens is that language finds a radically different terrain. It no longer needs to exist only in the memory of a few individuals. It begins to exist in hundreds of mouths simultaneously, in thousands of parallel conversations, in contexts so varied that no individual speaker could anticipate all of them. The redundancy that protects the system from collapsing grows. The diversity of usage contexts forces the system to expand to cover needs that never existed in the life of a small, relatively uniform group. Think about what it means for a language to have to name complex social relationships. In a group of a few dozen people, everyone has known each other since birth. Kinship relations are visible, immediate, embodied in faces everyone recognizes. A small language can afford to have imprecise terms for certain degrees of kinship because context resolves any ambiguity. But when groups grow, when villages merge, when lineages intersect in ways no one has experienced before, language needs to create distinctions where before there was only intuition. And this pressure of creation is productive. It pushes the system in directions that would simply be unnecessary on a smaller scale. The amplification mechanism works, therefore, in at least two simultaneous directions. On the one hand, larger size creates structural protection. The network of speakers becomes dense enough that individual variations are absorbed without distorting the central pattern. A child who learns a slightly different way to pronounce a certain vowel does not alter the language because around them there are hundreds of other children and adults whose collective practice anchors the pattern. On the other hand, larger size creates functional pressure. The variety of situations in which the language needs to operate expands beyond what any isolated speaker experiences, and this expansion forces the system to develop resources that otherwise would never be necessary. There is an analogy with what happens in ecosystems when the number of species surpasses a certain threshold. Below that threshold, the extinction of a single species can trigger cascading collapses because interdependencies are few and each carries disproportionate weight. Above the threshold, the system acquires a sort of distributed resilience. No single element is irreplaceable because others can fulfill similar functions in slightly different contexts. Languages in large communities acquire this quality. They develop synonyms where before there was only one term. They develop registers where before there was only one level. They develop internal dialects where before there was uniformity. And all this internal diversification paradoxically strengthens the system because it creates multiple paths to express any idea and reduces dependence on any single path. The visible manifestations of this amplification process are those things that anyone who has paid attention to the living language around them has already observed without necessarily having named. The first and most immediate is variation. There is no real-size linguistic community that is completely uniform. There are always differences between the ways different groups within the larger community pronounce certain words, choose certain terms, organize certain constructions. These differences are not noise. They are not imperfections in a system that should be uniform. They are precisely the sign that the language is alive in a sense that goes beyond metaphor, that it is responding to distinct local pressures while maintaining enough central coherence for communication between different groups to still be possible. The technical name for these internal variations is dialect, when the difference is geographically situated, and sociolect when the difference is associated with groups defined by class, profession, age, or other social factors. But these names, however precise, run the risk of making it seem that dialect and sociolect are deviations from a central norm that would be the true language. This interpretation reverses reality. Variation is primary. What we call standard language is always an abstraction built from variation, an average calculated for political and educational purposes, a convention chosen among equally legitimate options from a purely linguistic point of view. The prestige dialect that becomes the norm is no more correct than the dialects left on its margins. It is merely associated with the group that has enough power to define what counts as correct. The history behind the very term dialect is revealing of this tension. The word comes from ancient Greek and simply meant way of speaking, without any connotation of inferiority. In ancient Greece, there were countless recognized varieties of Greek: Attic, Doric, Ionic, Aeolic, and each was used in specific contexts and had prestige in different domains. Lyric poetry preferred Aeolic forms, Athenian philosophy and theatre used Attic, certain southern oral traditions used Doric. There was no fixed hierarchy. There were appropriate and inappropriate uses, but the idea that one variety was intrinsically superior to others would have seemed strange. What created the modern idea of dialect as something lesser than a language was the emergence of nation-states and the political need for a unified language that could serve as a symbol and instrument of national cohesion. When one variety is elevated to national language, all others automatically come to be seen as its dialects, as incomplete or corrupt versions of the central standard. This process happened throughout Europe over the last 15 centuries and created the impression that language is something natural and dialect is something derived, when in fact the process was precisely the opposite. Dialects are prior, and the unified language is the artificial construction that came later. Another important name in this taxonomy of the manifestations of variation is register. While dialect describes variations associated with places or social groups, register describes variations associated with situations of use. Any competent speaker of any language uses different registers without thinking about it, without realizing they are making a sophisticated choice. The way someone speaks to a small child is different from how they speak to a co-worker, which is different from how they speak in a job interview, which is different from how they speak with close friends in a conversation about personal matters. These differences are not just of vocabulary, they are of grammatical structure, syntactic complexity, rhythm, volume, and choice of which presuppositions can remain implicit and which need to be made explicit. The register that adults spontaneously use when speaking to small children has been studied in detail and has received several names over time: motherese, child-directed speech, baby talk in the technical and non-pejorative sense of the term. What studies have shown is that this way of speaking has remarkably consistent properties across very different languages and cultures: shorter sentences, more restricted vocabulary, more repetitions, more exaggerated intonation with wider melodic contours, focus on objects and events present in the child's immediate visual field. These properties are not arbitrary cultural conventions. They are intuitive responses to the cognitive and perceptual needs of a child who is precisely in the process of extracting patterns from a flow of sounds that is not yet organized into words with stable meanings. The register creates the conditions that facilitate acquisition. Notice what this means. Every adult speaker carries within themselves multiple overlapping systems, each calibrated for a type of situation, each with its own implicit rules about what is appropriate and what is strange. And this multiplicity is not a complication that makes language harder. It is precisely what makes language capable of serving such radically different functions. A language that had only one register would be adequate only for one type of relationship and one type of situation. The multiplicity of registers is what allows the same system to serve both intimacy and formality, both authority and equality, both instruction and seduction. You can notice this mechanism acting in yourself right now. Think about how you would describe tonight to a close friend tomorrow. The words you would choose, the tone you would use, the amount of context you would assume they already have, all this would form a specific register, informal, familiar, which presupposes a relationship of intimacy and a shared history. Now think about how you would describe the same night, the same set of facts, to someone you have never seen before. Another register would emerge almost automatically, more formal in structure, more explicit in references, more careful in choosing words that do not presuppose shared knowledge. The content would be the same, the system would be the same, but the form the system takes would be fundamentally different because the situation is different, and you know this without needing to think. Beyond dialect and register, there is a third manifestation that is perhaps the most intriguing, because it operates on timescales that extend beyond an individual life. Diachronic change, the transformation of language across generations. Anyone who tries to read texts in English from 6 or 7 centuries ago encounters a language they partially recognise, but that also leaves them lost in constructions and words that no longer exist in contemporary English. This distance is not the result of a collective decision to change. No one woke up one morning and decided that from that date onward, certain forms would be abandoned and others adopted. The change happened through thousands of tiny individual choices, each imperceptible in itself, each representing a slightly different variation that spread or did not spread depending on social factors, speaker prestige, frequency of use, ease of articulation. The sound that linguists reconstruct as being a fricative consonant that existed in Middle English gradually gave way to other forms in different regions. In some areas it disappeared completely, in others it merged with existing sounds. In still others, it survived in specific words while being replaced in others. This type of sound change, when it happens systematically, affects all words containing the sound in question, and therefore linguists can use these systematic correspondences to reconstruct how ancient languages sounded without ever having heard a single speaker of them. The conceptual apparatus that allows this reconstruction, which transformed historical linguistics into a discipline capable of precise statements instead of mere speculations, was developed mainly in the 19th century by a group of scholars who became known by the terms they created to describe their method. The phonetic law, the idea that sound changes are regular and systematic and not random, was the central principle that organized the entire reconstruction of language families. When they realized that certain consonants in Latin corresponded systematically to certain consonants in Old Germanic in ways that repeated across all words, not just some words, not others, they understood they were facing a law, not in the sense of a prescriptive norm, but in the sense of a descriptive regularity that revealed the underlying mechanism. The system we have described so far, with its internal variation organized into dialects and registers, with its temporal change regulated by phonetic laws and functional pressures, with its growing resilience as communities become larger and denser, is a system that seems to have found a form of equilibrium. Languages change but do not disappear abruptly. They diversify but maintain enough coherence for communication. They adapt to new functions without losing the old ones. There is a homeostatic quality to this equilibrium that can give the impression that the system is stable by nature, that language, once established in a sufficiently large community, simply persists and evolves gradually without the possibility of radical interruption. But this equilibrium is apparent. It is the equilibrium of a system that is in constant motion and that can, under certain conditions that the next pages of this journey will begin to examine, change state so rapidly that what seemed stable reveals its true nature. Not a fixed equilibrium, but a dynamic one, sustained by forces pointing in opposite directions and which, when these forces change in magnitude or direction, can produce transformations that no gradual phonetic law could predict or explain. The dynamic equilibrium that sustains a living language resembles, in certain aspects, the equilibrium of a cone resting on its vertex. The shape is technically stable, the laws of physics are respected, and an observer from afar might get the impression that the system is at rest. But any minimal disturbance, any slight deviation of energy introduced into the system, produces a fall that is not gradual, not negotiated, not proportional to the size of the initial disturbance. The cone falls entirely, quickly, so that the final state bears no predictable resemblance to the initial state. A language can exist for centuries in this kind of precarious equilibrium, functioning perfectly for all the communicative purposes of the community that uses it, without anyone noticing the accumulated tension in the forces that keep it where it is. The conditions that push a language out of this calm mode of operation are not mysterious when examined carefully. They emerge from something that the previous chapters of this journey established with patience. Language exists simultaneously as an instrument of communication and as a marker of identity, as a system of shared rules and as a symbolic territory of belonging. As long as these two roles point in the same direction, language floats elegantly, absorbing novelties, exporting words to other languages, losing some sounds and gaining others, without any transformation threatening its fundamental continuity. The problem arises when these two roles come into acute conflict, when the identity the language expresses comes to be perceived as threatened by the very world the language would need to describe to be useful. Imagine a community whose ancestors developed, over generations, an extraordinarily rich sound system to describe a specific environment, a landscape, an economy, a set of social relationships that organized life for centuries. This system is not just efficient within that context, it is the context itself captured and preserved in the structure of words. Then the environment changes, not necessarily by catastrophe, sometimes simply by the arrival of other people with other languages, by the opening of trade routes that bring new objects without local names, by political reorganization that places that community in constant contact with speakers of a different language. The language now faces a double and contradictory pressure. It needs to incorporate novelty to remain useful, but incorporating too much novelty means losing the uniqueness that makes it a recognizable marker of identity. It is at this point of tension that what linguists call intense language contact begins, and it is in this phenomenon that some of the most dramatic processes human language has ever produced are found. Contact itself is not dramatic. Languages have always been in contact, have always borrowed from one another, have always mixed vocabularies through trade and war and marriage and migration. What transforms contact into crisis is the asymmetry of power. When two languages meet in conditions of relative equality, they exchange, each keeping its central structure intact and adding elements from the other as external layers that enrich without displacing the core. But when one language arrives backed by political, economic, military or religious power, and the other exists only as the expression of a community that does not hold that power, contact ceases to be an exchange and becomes a pressure. Linguistic pressure operates in ways that only become visible in retrospect, like erosion marks on a cliff that seem tiny each day, but reveal their scope when observed on the scale of decades. First, speakers of the less powerful language begin to learn the dominant language to access resources, opportunities, social mobility. This initial bilingualism seems harmless and even advantageous to the individual, but bilingualism creates an internal hierarchy where one language comes to be associated with the future and success, while the other becomes associated with the past and limitation. Parents begin to hesitate between teaching the ancestral language to their children and teaching the language their children will need to prosper. In communities where economic pressure is intense enough, this hesitation is quickly resolved in favour of the dominant language. The next generation grows up hearing their ancestral language in the mouths of grandparents, in specific domestic contexts in ceremonies and songs, but using the other language to study, work, shop, date, dream. This generation still understands the grandparents' language, can still speak rudiments of it, but has not inhabited it from the inside, has not acquired it with the depth that comes from using it to think in all domains of experience. And then this generation has children, and these children grow up in an environment where the ancestral language is even more peripheral, even more associated with specific moments, even further from daily life. The threshold is crossed without anyone having decided to cross it. No law was enacted, no order was given, no generation deliberately abandoned what the grandparents built. The language simply ceased to be transmitted with the completeness necessary for the next generation to receive it as a living system. Linguists who study this process have identified that it obeys a threshold dynamic with precise and measurable characteristics. A language can survive with a very small number of speakers if those speakers transmit it fully to children, and if the community maintains spaces of daily use where the language is necessary. On the other hand, a language can decline even having hundreds of thousands of speakers if those speakers are all adults and no child is acquiring it as a first language. The absolute size of the speaker community matters much less than the dynamics of intergenerational transmission. This is why some languages of small island communities survived for millennia, while languages of large continental civilizations disappeared in a few centuries after contact with colonial powers. The most dramatic phenomenon this process produces is what scholars call language death, an expression that remains controversial because it attributes to symbolic systems a quality that belongs to living beings, but which accurately captures something real in the experience of those who witness it. A dying language does not simply shrink proportionally. It undergoes intense internal transformations, as if the system, perceiving its own instability, tried to reorganize itself in increasingly radical ways. The last native speakers of a dying language often use grammatical forms that older speakers never used, simplify complex structures, eliminate distinctions that were central to the older system, mix elements of the dominant language in ways that would have been unthinkable for previous generations. The language transforms rapidly precisely while it is disappearing, as if the speed of change and the proximity of silence were aspects of the same phenomenon. The breaking point where a language crossed from dynamic equilibrium to irreversible decline is rarely perceived at the moment it happens. There are documented cases of communities that only noticed the process when children stopped understanding their grandparents, when the language stopped functioning as a means of communication within the extended family, when the remaining native speakers began to have difficulty finding words in situations that would have been trivial in their youth. This final stage has a precise technical name, semi-speaker, designating someone who acquired a language incompletely, who understands it better than they produce it, who uses it with hesitations and gaps that reveal the incompleteness of acquisition. The existence of semi-speakers in a community is one of the most reliable indicators that the erosion process has already passed a point of difficult return. But the dramatic phenomena produced by language contact are not limited to disappearance. There are also creations. Among the most extraordinary phenomena that emerge from situations of intense contact are pidgins and creoles, linguistic systems that arise precisely in the conditions of rupture and pressure that dynamic equilibrium could not sustain. A pidgin emerges when speakers of mutually unintelligible languages urgently need to communicate for practical purposes, typically in contexts of forced trade or collective labour under coercion, and collectively build a simplified system that takes vocabulary predominantly from one of the contact languages but drastically reduces its morphology and simplifies its syntax. The pidgin is not the dominant language simplified. It is a new creation, an emergent system that none of the groups in contact consciously designed, which arose in the gaps between existing systems. What happens when children grow up hearing only a pidgin as the main language of the domestic environment is one of the most eloquent phenomena linguistics has ever documented. These children do not acquire the pidgin as such. They transform it, expanding its grammar, introducing distinctions of tense and aspect and modality that the pidgin lacked, creating a new system that is more complex, more regular, and more expressive than what they heard from adults. This new system is a creole, and its creation demonstrates something profound about the human capacity for language, that children do not just learn the language offered to them, but actively contribute to building it, and that this contribution follows predictable patterns suggesting the existence of innate tendencies in the organization of human linguistic systems. Creoles created in historically distinct contexts, separated by oceans and centuries, show structural similarities that are difficult to explain by contact with each other. They tend to order words in specific ways, tend to create particular grammatical distinctions, tend to resolve the ambiguities of the pidgin in analogous ways. This does not mean all creoles are the same. Each bears the specific marks of the languages that came into contact to create it, of the precise historical context of its emergence, of the communities that adopted it as their main language. But the transversal similarities are strong enough to fuel decades of debate about what exactly they reveal regarding the internal architecture of the human linguistic capacity. Humanity began to observe and measure these phenomena systematically less than 2 centuries ago, and the urgency that drove this effort came precisely from the recognition that many languages were disappearing before any record of them was made. The work of linguistic documentation is different from the work of describing a living stable language. Documenting an endangered language means working with a small and decreasing number of speakers, often elderly, often the only remnants of an entire way of inhabiting the world in words. It means recording not just grammars and vocabularies but stories, songs, ways of narrating time and space, systems of classifying reality that find no equivalents in any other known language. It means knowing that the record, however careful, captures only a shadow of what was alive. The instruments linguists have developed to measure the vitality of a language include counts of speakers, by age group, analysis of intergenerational transmission, evaluation of domains of use, and study of community attitudes toward their own language. This last factor is perhaps the most unpredictable and the most powerful. A community that maintains positive attitudes toward its language, associating it with pride and affirmed identity instead of backwardness and limitation, can sustain a language for additional generations even under conditions of intense external pressure. A shift in these attitudes in a negative direction can dramatically accelerate decline, and conversely, a shift in a positive direction can produce revitalization phenomena that some scholars considered impossible until they saw them happen. While you rest, somewhere in the world, one of the last native speakers of a language is sleeping with it intact inside them, carrying in their brain sound and grammatical structures that exist in no other living mind, knowing words for nuances of twilight light, or for kinship relations or for internal states that no other language on the planet has thought to name. And somewhere else, a child is hearing fragments of a language the grandparents speak to each other, fragments they do not fully understand, but that are depositing something in layers that neuroscience still cannot describe with precision. And somewhere else still, a linguist is recording the voice of someone who knows they are the last, trying to capture before silence arrives what took millennia to build. These processes of intense transformation, of rupture and creation, of extinction and emergence, do not happen in isolation from the larger forces that have shaped the course of human speech since the origins that the previous parts of this journey have been tracing with patience. Language has never existed alone. From the very first moments when some ancestor of ours began to produce sounds with the intention of being understood, this phenomenon has been intertwined with another system of comparable complexity, with another process that also grows, branches, goes extinct, and is reborn in forms no one foresaw. Language and human culture are not two parallel phenomena that occasionally touch. They are systems that interpenetrate so deeply that trying to separate one from the other is like trying to separate the tide from the ocean that produces it. One does not exist without the other, and the exchanges between them occur in all directions at once, on all timescales simultaneously. When a language absorbs a word from another, it seems superficially like a linguistic event. But what is happening is a transfer of cognitive structure. The English language has absorbed hundreds of words from French, Latin, Norse, and contemporary global tongues over the centuries, and with each of those words it also absorbed a fragment of how other peoples carved up reality. The word beef came from French and brought with it a trail of Norman social hierarchy. The word shampoo came from Hindi and brought with it a way of perceiving bodily care that European languages lacked in that specific form. Every linguistic borrowing is a fusion of conceptual worlds, a transfer of energy between two cultural systems that met. This interchange works in both directions with equal force. Culture shapes language when it creates new naming needs, when certain distinctions become so important they need their own words, when social life complexifies in ways that demand more refined vocabulary for the bonds between people, for degrees of respect, for nuances of obligation and belonging. But language also shapes culture in ways that are harder to see because they are inside each speaker, not outside. The grammatical structure of a language guides its speaker's attention towards certain things and not others. Languages that grammatically mark the distinction between direct and indirect evidence, between what was seen personally and what was heard from third parties, create speakers accustomed to registering the origin of knowledge as relevant data in every statement. This is not just a linguistic difference, it is a difference in the structure of collective thought, in the everyday epistemology of a people. What makes this system of exchanges even more fascinating is that it possesses feedback loops that feed on themselves and amplify over time. Consider the following chain, which sociolinguists have documented in dozens of communities around the planet. A linguistic innovation arises in a group of high social prestige, in a young generation of an urban centre, in an ethnic group whose cultural vitality is on the rise. This innovation begins to spread because speaking like this group speaks is socially valued. It is a way of signalling belonging or aspiration. As it spreads, it begins to be perceived as an identity marker, which increases its prestige among those who want to identify with this group, which further accelerates dissemination, which makes it more salient in speakers' consciousness, which turns it into an object of conscious imitation, which consolidates it in the norm of the language, which eventually neutralizes it as a prestige marker because now everyone uses it, which frees up space for a new innovation to start the cycle again. This cycle, on the scale of decades, produces changes that any speaker can perceive by comparing the language of their childhood with the language of their grandchildren. In the English-speaking world, the transformations that occurred over the 20th century have been recorded in enough detail to reveal these rhythms. The pronunciation of certain vowels shifted measurably. The system of modal verbs underwent profound reorganization. The syntax of relative clauses transformed, with speakers preferring constructions that their great-grandparents would have considered strange or incomplete. Each of these changes, seen up close, seems small. Viewed on the scale of 150 or 200 years, it represents a substantial transformation. On the scale of centuries, the same processes produce results that already surpass the recognizable. The English that Chaucer wrote at the end of the 14th century is readable for a contemporary speaker with effort, but replete with forms that seem archaic, with words that have disappeared, with constructions that today would sound wrong. The English of Shakespeare, writing in the 16th century, would seem to Chaucer's reader like a foreign language in disguise. In 500 years, what was mutually intelligible became historically distant. In 1,000 years, languages that shared a common ancestor ceased to recognize each other as relatives without specialized analysis. On the scale of millennia, the processes we observe in everyday linguistics reveal their accumulated power more completely. Proto-Indo-European, spoken approximately 6,000 years ago, somewhere in the Eurasian steppes, is today only a reconstruction, a mathematical projection derived from the systematic comparison of dozens of living and dead languages. But from its body came Sanskrit and Latin, Greek and Persian, Germanic and Slavic, and from each of those branches came in turn dozens of other languages. Hindi, Farsi, Russian, English, Spanish, Portuguese, Punjabi, Bengali, Armenian, Albanian are all descendants of that single common ancestor, just as the lion, tiger, leopard and domestic cat are all descendants of a common feline ancestor. The diversity we see today is the accumulated product of 6,000 years of drift, separation, innovation and transformation operating simultaneously in hundreds of communities with no coordinating centre. On the scale of hundreds of thousands of years, we reach the frontiers of what historical linguistics can see. Beyond a certain point, comparative methods lose resolution. Linguistic reconstruction works backward, using regularities in sound and grammatical systems to infer ancestral forms, but these patterns become unrecognizable after enough generations of accumulated transformation. What would have existed 200,000 years ago when anatomical Homo sapiens was already present, but when full linguistic capacities might still have been in formation, is something historical linguistics cannot reach directly. There, investigation must be done with other tools, with cognitive archaeology, with evolutionary genetics, with comparative neuroscience, with primatology. And it is at this point that sensitivity to initial conditions becomes a subject not just scientific, but almost philosophical. Complex dynamic systems like ecosystems, like climates, like economies, like languages, possess a property that mathematicians describe precisely, but that human intuition resists fully accepting. Small differences in initial conditions, differences that at a given moment seemed negligible, can produce, after enough time, enormous divergences in outcomes. The language you speak today is not just the product of great migrations and historical conquests. It is also the product of who married whom in a village that no longer exists, of a trade route that was abandoned for reasons documents did not record, of a social prestige that a group gained or lost due to circumstances that would seem trivial to contemporaries. This means that predicting the future of human language has fundamental limits that are not just limits of data or computational capacity, but limits inherent to the nature of the system. We can observe short-term trends with some confidence. We can say that languages like Mandarin and English today have a base of speakers and socio-economic prestige that make them robust for the coming generations. We can say that technological acceleration is creating pressures for linguistic homogenization without historical precedent. We can say that the rate of extinction of small languages does not seem to have slowed down significantly, but we cannot say which language will be at the center of the world 300 years from now, because that would depend on predicting political, economic, climatic, and technological developments that are themselves unpredictable beyond certain horizons. What is possible to say, based on what history has recorded, is that the human linguistic system as a whole has shown remarkable resilience. Languages have been extinguished by conquest, by forced assimilation, by demographic collapse. Some have been extinguished completely, leaving no descendants. But the phenomenon of language itself has never been extinguished, and linguistic diversity, although threatened in certain eras, has never been reduced to a single universal language. Even when empires tried to impose a common language over vast territories, as Rome did with Latin, the result was not permanent uniformity, but subsequent fragmentation into new daughter languages, each with its own trajectory. The history of Latin is the history of a system that seemingly converged toward unity, and then branched out again into Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, French, Romanian, and dozens of smaller varieties, each carrying the ancestor within it, but also being something new. There is something profoundly beautiful in this pattern, when one manages to see it whole, when one steps back far enough for individual details to lose focus and the general shape to appear. A system that is at once governed by rules and permanently fleeing those rules. A system that is transmitted with enough fidelity for communication to work between generations, but with enough variation so that no generation speaks exactly like the previous one. A system that tends toward simplification in certain dimensions and toward complexification in others, in such a way that human languages in general maintain a total complexity that oscillates within a range, never collapsing into triviality, nor becoming incomprehensible to human cognition, as if the system knew, without knowing, what space it could inhabit. This sensation of a system that seems to know what it is doing without anyone knowing, for it is one of the strangest and richest that the contemplation of a language offers. Each speaker acts locally, without a plan, without the intention of participating in a history that far exceeds their life. A child acquiring their language is not preserving a cultural heritage, at least not consciously. They are simply doing what human cognition is compelled to do when exposed to the speech of other people. A teenager who introduces a new way of speaking in their group is not deliberating on linguistic evolution. They are signaling belonging, creating distinction, participating in social dynamics that existed long before them and will continue long after. An adult who abandons the minority language of their parents in favor of the dominant language of their country is not doing linguistic politics. They are making a pragmatic decision about where their life can flourish. And from these countless individual decisions made without coordination and without an overarching vision, an order emerges. An order that is visible only from afar, only in retrospect, only when someone takes the trouble to document enough for the patterns to appear. Just as from the individual interactions of water molecules the tide emerges, which no individual molecule is trying to create. just as from the activity of billions of neurons thought emerges, which no individual neuron experiences or plans. Human language is an emergent phenomenon of a depth we still cannot fully describe. We know it exists. We know some of the conditions that make it possible, some of the pressures that shape it, some of the mechanisms by which it transforms. But the complete experience of the phenomenon, what it means to be inside a language, to inhabit it, to think in it, to dream in it, to lose someone who spoke it, that escapes descriptions and remains as something every human being knows from the inside, but that no measuring instrument captures entirely. There is something that runs through all this, something that is present in the first word a remote ancestor produced with intention, and in the last word of a dying language, and in the first word a child says this morning somewhere on the planet, something that lies beneath the diversity of sounds, the different grammars, the histories of migration and conquest, the theories about origins and the debates about mechanisms, something simple enough to have arisen once and remained, something resilient enough to have survived mass extinctions of languages and cultures without ever completely disappearing. What that something is will still be said. That something is the need to be heard, not the need to transmit information, although language does that with an efficiency no other species has developed comparably, not the need to coordinate collective actions, although groups that learned to do this survived where others perished. Not the need to name the world, although naming is one of the oldest and most persistent gestures the human mind knows. The deepest need is prior to all this and sustains all this. The need for inner experience to find an exterior where it can also exist, where it can be recognized, where it can last a little longer than the duration of a single nervous system. When the first ancestor who tried to communicate something with intention opened their mouth and produced a sound that pointed beyond themselves, what was happening in that instant was a being refusing the absolute solitude of consciousness. There were no words to describe this at that moment, because words did not yet exist. There was only the impulse, the movement toward the other, the bet that what existed inside could exist outside too, that the space between two beings could be crossed. This impulse never stopped. It became more elaborate, more refined, more laden with structure and history. It generated grammars of a complexity we still do not fully understand, vocabularies that tell the stories of migrations no one recorded, sound systems that function as invisible architectures sustaining the thought of entire communities. But at the center of all this, functioning like the seed from which everything grew, was that original refusal of solitude, the feedback loop that made language expand and complexify over hundreds of thousands of years works exactly because of this. When an attempt at communication is successful, when the interior of one being finds recognition in the interior of another being, something happens in both that makes them more inclined to try again. The circuit in the brain that associates communication with something worth repeating is the same circuit that regulates motivation for almost everything human beings persist in doing. It releases the chemical messengers the body uses to mark an experience as something to be sought again. Every time language worked, it became a little more likely to be used again, a little more central to the group's life, a little more integrated into how the group understood itself. But there is also the mechanism that stabilizes, that prevents language from dissolving into chaotic variation. Every language carries within itself a force that pulls toward conservation, that prefers established forms to random innovations, that transmits to the young what the old already know, before allowing the young to add what the old do not yet know. This tension between conservation and innovation is what makes a language alive. It changes continuously, but in a way that maintains intelligibility between generations, that allows a grandmother and a granddaughter to understand each other, even if the words the granddaughter uses for certain things are words the grandmother never learned. The molecular dimension of this is more concrete than it seems when speaking only of cultures and histories. Inside every neuron that participates in any act of language, there are processes occurring on scales of time and space that the imagination has difficulty grasping. The proteins that form the channels through which ions cross cell membranes are molecules that folded into specific shapes determined by sequences of instructions that came from previous generations, shapes that were selected over a time so vast that the word ancestral begins to lose its usual weight. When someone hears a word and recognizes it, what happens is a cascade of electrochemical events running through networks with a density of connections that has no parallel in any other object nature has produced. A single word activates patterns involving regions separated by considerable distances within the same skull, regions that specialists have spent decades mapping and that still hold more questions than answers. And these molecules, these channels, these networks are not fixed. Every use of language leaves physical traces in brain tissue. Connections that are used repeatedly become faster and more efficient. Those left unused weaken. The brain of a person who has spent decades inside a language is literally different in its physical architecture from the brain of a person who has never had contact with that language. A language is not just a system of sounds and rules that exist outside the people who speak it. It exists inside them, inscribed in the matter they are made of, present in how their neurons have learned to organize. This is what makes the loss of a language so painful. When the last person who speaks a language dies, it is not just a set of words that could have been recorded and preserved that disappears. A specific way of organizing experience that was inscribed in living beings disappears, which existed in the way certain neurons had learned to connect in response to the world, which shaped what was perceptible and what remained in the shadows, what could be thought easily and what required effort. A perspective that the universe had developed to look at itself disappears, and it cannot be reconstructed from external records because what it was depended on being inhabited from the inside. As an integrated system, human language has properties that none of its parts has when considered in isolation. A sound alone means nothing. A grammatical rule alone does not produce communication. A vocabulary without grammar is an inventory, not a language. A grammar without speakers is a lifeless scheme. But when sounds, rules, vocabularies, speakers, social contexts, shared histories, and communication needs combine in a specific way, what emerges is not just a tool more efficient than its parts. What emerges is a completely new way of existing in the world, a way that did not exist before and that transforms everything it touches. Emergence is the process by which patterns of seemingly impossible complexity arise from combinations of simple elements following relatively modest rules. What linguists have discovered over decades of study is that the rules governing the deep structure of human languages are, in a sense, surprisingly simple. A small number of principles, applied recursively, is capable of generating a quantity of grammatically possible sentences that exceeds any number that could be enumerated in a person's lifetime. From a limited set of sounds, from a lexicon that no person knows entirely, and from a set of rules that a child learns without explicit instruction in the first years of life, emerges the capacity to describe dreams, to propose theories about star formation, to write poems that other people will read centuries later, to tell someone that life is worth living when that person can no longer believe it alone. This emergence was not planned by anyone. It has no inventor. It has, instead, a history that began long before any record and that continues now, at this moment, in every conversation happening anywhere on the planet, in every child learning what words can do, in every poet looking for a combination of words that does not yet exist, and that, when it does, will make someone feel something they didn't know could be felt. Deep down, language is simply the space between. It is the space between one being and another, the place where solitude meets its natural limit, where the interior of one person reaches the interior of another, and for a moment the two existences touch in a way that nothing else in the universe seems capable of providing with the same precision. Every sound a remote ancestor produced with intention was an attempt to cross this space. Every grammar a community developed over generations was a way to make this crossing more reliable. Every new word a language created was a response to some experience that needed to exist also in the space between people, that could not remain confined to a single skull without losing something essential. Every language that formed from the separation of a group was the space between taking a new shape, adapting to a new world, developing new angles of entry for the same need. And every time a child says their first word, what happens is not just the beginning of linguistic competence. It is the moment a new human being discovers that the space between is not an abyss but a bridge, that what exists inside can exist outside too, that the other can be reached. This moment has happened countless times throughout the entire history of the species. It is happening now, this morning, somewhere, and the child living this moment does not know they are repeating the oldest gesture of all. The theories researchers have developed about the origins of language, the debates about whether it arose suddenly or gradually, about whether it began with gesture or voice, about whether there is a universal grammar inscribed in the brain, or whether each language builds its own structure, about how many times language arose independently. All these questions are different ways of asking the same thing. How the space between became crossable. Every answer science offers, every piece of bone that tells something about the anatomy of an ancestor, every genetic pattern that maps a migration, every record of a sound change over centuries, is a fragment of the map of how humanity learned that the space between could be crossed. The diversity of languages that exist today, the thousands of ways the human voice has learned to organize itself into coherent systems of communication, is not a contradiction of the unity of language. It is the proof of it. Every different language is the space between taking a shape that serves a specific community in a specific world, responding to specific needs with specific resources. But in all of them, beneath all the variation, the need to cross the space between is the same. Everything said before arrives here. The modifications in the vocal tract that allowed more precise sounds were modifications that made the space between easier to cross. The specialization of the brain that created regions dedicated to language was matter learning to better serve that impulse to reach the other. The cultural transmission that allows languages to survive across generations is the space between persisting beyond the life of any individual, becoming something that belongs to the group and not just the people who compose it. The extinction of languages is the closing of specific paths through the space between, the disappearance of bridges that took a long time to build. The creation of new languages is the opening of new paths, the discovery that the space between can be crossed in ways that had not yet been attempted. And all this continues now, while you rest. Somewhere, people are conversing in languages you will never hear, crossing the space between in ways you will never know, saying things that could not be said in any other language with the same exactness. Somewhere, a child is learning that words exist and that they can use them to reach the people they love. Somewhere, someone is finding the right word for something they spent years unable to say, and the person listening is feeling they were reached in a way they didn't expect. While you rest, language continues doing what it has always done, crossing the space between, keeping human beings connected to each other through everything that could separate them. You are part of this. Every time you said something that needed to be said, every time you heard something that needed to be heard, every time a word found in you the right place to land, you were participating in the same process that began before any record, that crossed everything time put in its way, that reached you carrying with it the entire history of how human beings learned that the other can be reached. You're safe now. What needed to be said was said. What needed to be heard was heard. The space between is at peace tonight, and you're inside it, connected to everything human language has built over a time the mind cannot embrace all at once. The universe takes care of you. It took care of all the ancestors who tried to reach the other before knowing it was possible, who produced sounds in the dark without being sure they would be understood, who insisted on the attempt until the attempt became a capacity. It takes care of you now, who rests after carrying the whole day, after using the heritage of those ancestors in everything you thought and said and heard. Everything is in order. The languages that exist continue existing. The children who are learning continue learning. The dreams that need words to become real continue waiting for the right words. And you can rest now, because none of this needs you awake to continue. While you rest, language continues crossing the space between. You are part of this. You always have been. Let thoughts become slower now. Let words dissolve into the silence they came from. Beneath all languages, beneath all sounds, beneath all the history of how the human voice learned to organize itself into bridges between people, there is a silence that is not the absence of language, but the ground upon which language exists. A silence that was there before the first word and will be there after the last, and that is as welcoming as any word ever spoken with care. You are descending toward that silence now. Each breath takes you a little deeper. Each exhale takes with it a little more of the day's weight. The space between you and sleep is getting smaller, and you don't need any words to cross it. You are safe. The universe takes care of you. Everything is in order. The universe continues its silent dance, and we rest in its embrace. Thank you for walking with me tonight. Sleep well.